Good morning, Richard, and thank you very much for the fanfare. That is the beginning, I'm sure you recognise it, of the Crown of India March of Elgar. It's the first item on an Elgar retrospective, which has recordings, as you said, couldn't be much earlier than this, from 1912, which was that one, right through to the beginning or the end of the Second World War, a time when the art of recording was going through the most extraordinary development. I mean, I suppose it's done almost as much since, but that was the time when people were going for sound. That was a pre-electric recording, and I am absolutely astonished by the quality of that sound. There seems to be a sort of slightly nasal presence there, but I mean, you feel that there are some real instrumentalists there. You can recognise the tone colours. But what I found most interesting about that was the quality of the playing. They almost seem, as I thought when I first heard it, to be playing it by numbers, rather like those paintings that you used to be able to get, you know, sort of put your red in here and you end up with a Titian. They still haven't worked out quite what the correct Elgar sound is and how to phrase it. And later on in that particular example, there are some rather complicated passages for the bass instruments, and they don't really know whether they should be soloized or whether they're just sort of something which should be sounding in the background. And each note is played with an extraordinary sort of nervousness.
I mean, they were the Xenophone House Orchestra, weren't they? The sort of pickup band, the Black Diamonds band.
Yes, they were. I mean, I actually don't know very much about how much work they did, but there is an impression that they've just been dragged around from the, you know, they found that they've got 5 minutes extra on the session. Come back, lads, you know, you come back from the pub and finish that one. But you see, this music was very new then, and there is a quality which I find still very exciting, even through all that distance of time, of experimentalism about it, both in the sound and the way to play it.
I mean, you say one would recognise that, but actually, it's not included in the usual Crown of India suite, is it? I mean, it was recorded later in the early days in acoustic in the early days of electric, but it hasn't been recorded since. So it's actually, as a piece of music, it's quite a rarity.
Absolutely, and this is the only recording still of that particular number. And this disc is full of some wonderful things. We'll hear some of them later. But as I said, it reviews some of the most historic Elgar recordings pretty well over the whole period of his recorded lifetime. That is to say that when he was alive and they were making recordings, till about 10 years after his death. And it's a very interesting disc from the point of view of people who are keen on Elgar as such, but also, I think, on the history of English singing, which has been slightly not quite the right thing to talk about. You know, English singers were always regarded as somewhat not quite up to the standard of their continental rivals, but actually this disc makes you realise their skills and their style.
I mean, it's called the Elgar's Interpreters on Record, and there's an interesting record here, which was in Elgar's own collection, which was a bit of Caractacus, an aria from Caractacus, sung by Peter Dawson, no less, with Barbaroli conducting in 1928.
Absolutely, an early Barbaroli recording, and for me, this was an absolute revelation. It suddenly showed me why. I mean, I suppose when I first came to Barbaroli, he'd already been practically at the end of his life and was already well established as an Elgarian. I didn't realise how much he seemed to have an instinct for it so early. I mean, if you just listen to the quality of the orchestral playing and the way he supports the voice here, you will understand why I think he is one of the greatest Elgarian conductors.
My brand of fight, lash to the heavens thine edges bright, where those sharp lips of steel shall go, red from the kiss of hands shall flow, and many a gallant head lie low. Leap, leap, to the night. Be thou my bard with note of fire, to sound through heaven my royal lyre. Sing to the fiery echoes roll, to every freeborn warrior soul, and pierce the left that sleeps the fall. Sing, sing to the light. Cry, make it to a country free, garden of gold be none for thee, land of my sires, land of mine, hark to the song and make it thine. Wake, wake, and see my single sign. Wake, wake, for the light. Wake, light.
Splendid. The sword song, Leap, Leap to the Light, from Conductors, with Peter Dawson and an orchestra, Conductor John Barbaroli. Wonderful slides, wonderful portamenti there right at the beginning. As you
Just imagine the gestures as he got them to do that. Mind you, of course, that was the style of playing in the days.
Yes, yes. And there's a lot of little gems here. There's that famous test pressing that Kathleen Ferrier made of My Work Is Done from Grontius in June 1944. That's been on LP before, but it's marvellous to have it here.
The Grontius that never happened.
Yes. I mean, I actually think that there's some earlier Grontius extracts on this 1916 recording when Clara Butt was doing all that fundraising for the Red Cross under Sir Henry Wood. I didn't find that so interesting.
No, both the quality of the recording and the performance there, I don't think was up to standard. But again, it's a historical item, and this is an archive disc. This is for somebody who wants to sort of put a personal history together and to remember things and to sort of, as you had just done yourself, fit them into a context. The wartime, the histories, what's going on around Elgar's life.
Well, I'm going to provide a further point of context because when that Grontius recording was being made in 1916, of course, that strange piece that Elgar wrote in the First World War, Starlight Express, was having its first performance. And of course, Elgar was really attracted to the gramophone by the idea of recording the Starlight Express, because you can get that recording on Pearl. But what we've got here, and I find this charming, is extracts from the Starlight Express, sung by Alice Moxon and Stuart Robertson in a recording made for HMV in 1935. And this is... It reminds me a little bit of that famous recording of Henry Hall and the Teddy Bear's Picnic. It's that wonderful 1930s BBC sound and diction, wonderful quality.
It makes you realise exactly how much language develops, let alone singing or music or recording styles. The way we speak has changed. You only got to listen to the old newsreels and you get that. And but also the quality of voice production, both the way that Peter Dawson was singing. Peter Dawson, of course, was an Australian, one of the early Australians coming over here to make a success. And they claim, don't they, that the strine vowels open up the mouth and get it very forward. But Stuart Robinson has got that very, very forward placing of the voice, which, of course, for the kind of equipment that they had in those days, was absolutely ideal.
Well, let's hear the most popular number, My Old Tunes.
Broken, and they come from far away, bringing just a little token of a long forgotten day, when the children came to listen t'other side the garden fence, and my heart leapt out of prison at the gift of 7 pence. Just beyond the haystack shadow, long ago that leafy June, how they danced about the meadow at the rising of the moon, while from out a railway carriage, standing ready and alight, stepped their guests as to a marriage, asked to dine and stay the night. Speak and laugh and dance together.
My Old Tunes from the Starlight Express, recorded by Stuart Robertson in 1935. I love that. It's a different world, isn't it?
He's hardly singing there, is he? It's very light in the voice, and it is a style of singing which was very popular then. It's actually very close, as you intimated, to light music. And for, I suppose, the first 55 years of this century, British serious music and light music were thought of almost, side by side. They've only recently diverged, and I think that's been to everybody's detriment, because there is a tremendous repertoire of wonderful music, to which Elgar contributed as well, of light music, which is lost.
Starlight Express.
But now, be clear whose Starlight Express we're talking about.
Yes, I think we're clear about that. Well, this is a production by the Elgar Society, and it's volume 1 of what's going to be a series of Elgar's interpreters on record, and it's vocal and dramatic music. You can get it in the shops, and you can get it from the Elgar Society. I suspect for most people, we're going to put the Elgar Society details on CFAX, which should be there at midday. But I'm told that if you go into the shop and say, I want this record, this splendid record from the Elgar Society, it's on Dutton Laboratories, and the number is CDAX 8019. I think you should be able to get it. I think it's going to be available from Dutton and from the Elgar Society, and then after 6 months, you won't be able to get it from the Elgar Society anymore. But splendid initiative by the Society. Now, the next record is on a label called Avid, and it's well named. It's got one of these. It's rather American-looking front. It's mainly of House of the Planets, 1945 recording of by Sir Adrian Boult and the BBC Symphony Orchestra, in the clarity and reality of three-dimensional sound. Audiophile quality remastering, great performances of the 20th century. Now, is this all it's cracked up to be technically?
Big claims being made, aren't they? I mean, the most interesting thing for me about the Avid Master Series is the tremendous range of interesting recordings, of interesting recorded performances that they are making available. Weingartner's Beethoven and Walton and conducting his own music, which is wonderful. I mean, the performances themselves are wonderful. They would be almost on any medium. But what they're claiming here is what you just threw out at me then, three-dimensional sound. I have to say that my impression is that it's not. It's very difficult to get so close to work on a recording, to try and make it live, because the closer you get to it, you really can't see the wood for the trees. And I have a feeling that they have kind of hypnotized themselves with their own technology here. We all do it. We play a record and we have an immediate first response. We go back to it the next day. We're used to it already. And I don't think it is as three-dimensional as they claim. In fact, what I do think is that they have given it some kind of fake presence. We'll hear some of it in a minute, and you can judge whether I'm talking sense. But there seems to be an added brightness to it, perhaps some added bass, but we all know those tricks. They're very simple. You can do it at home, practically. Surround sound or something like that. They don't seem actually to have got, as they claim, between the notes. Now, they talk about, in their blurb, some very tricky methods of phasing so that you get an impression of space around individual instruments. It made me think immediately of what a piano tuner does when he comes to make your piano sound a bit gentler. He forks out the felt on the hammers, and it's just a bit, the pile gets a bit deeper, but it's still basically the hammer that it was. This is two-dimensional with a bit of added gloss.
That said, we've got the BBC Symphony Orchestra, still, despite the war, in its first great phase, under Sir Adrian Boult, a conductor. I mean, in those days, conductors balanced the orchestra. It wasn't done by engineers, the conductors balanced it. And the sound, I think, they made it down in Bedford. They were still down there, having been evacuated there during the war.
That's right, they were still there.
I mean, I find this 1945, I mean, Health of the Planet, it's not just an orchestral showpiece. It was written in the First World War, at the beginning of the First World War. I mean, it is one of the great, in some ways, tragic works of the 20th century. I mean, it starts in war and it ends in dissolution and death and eternity. And hearing a performance made in 1945, I mean, to hear Mars recorded in 1945, it seems to me have, again, a special historic significance.
Well, all that you say is absolutely true, and the excitement, the commitment in the playing comes through. Okay, it's a little bit messy here and there, but it's live, and it has that quality of living dangerously on the edge. The presence is there. You can feel the instrumentalists, as it were, quite close to you. But of course it's live, so there are a few bloops, and I suppose in a way you listen out for those and you let them pass, but it adds to the excitement. I mean, if you would hear a rather unfortunate trumpeter in this example.
Jupiter from Sir Adrian Bolt's 1945 recording of Hosts, the planets. I like the performance. As I said, I like the sense of history, the sense of atmosphere about it. There's some Walton on this record as well, which gives it interest. I noticed the Spitfire fugue from the film The First of the Few, recorded by the Halley Orchestra under Walton himself in June 1943. Again.
Yes, I mean, the wartime is all over this disc, and so is the sound quality, and that's what I quite like about it. But that's why I think Abbott's claims are slightly overdone, because you still are perfectly aware of where and when these recordings were made, and it's just the sort of yellowing photographs are just coming up slightly yellower.
Yes. Well, Avid, who I gather distribute themselves, the number is Avid AMSC 582. AMSC 582. Now, Testament have put out a Bolt disc conducting Elgar. There's Falstaff, recorded in 1950 in Abbey Road. The Nursery Suite, which is recorded in 1955, so a little bit later. And one or two bits and pieces, including Elgar's orchestration of Bach's Fantasia and Fugue in C minor, which is 1949. I was a little bit surprised that Stuart Brown decided to put this out, because A, the LPA wasn't in particularly good shape in the late 40s, early 50s, and also I find the recordings really rather rusty.
I can't imagine. I'm not here to speak for him. I don't know what was in his mind, but clearly everybody's doing it. And Bolt's Elgar is still interesting a lot of people. It has done for 20-odd, 30-odd years. And I agree with you to a certain extent about the performance, but what I'm fascinated by on this one, above all, is the sound quality. It made me immediately think of those wonderful old interwar village halls with sort of white stucco on the outside and false rafters on the inside, you know. It's such an English quality of...
So you like it?
I actually like it.
Yes.
Now, it took me by surprise when I first listened to it, and I thought, this is completely unsophisticated. What are they doing throwing sound like this at me? And then it drew me into the music. I felt that I was sitting almost at the front desk of the cellos, and the balance overall seemed pretty good. But it seems to me to be absolutely right, particularly for Falstaff. Now, I think the problem with a work like Falstaff is that people think of Elgar as a sort of English Richard Strauss, which he was and he wasn't. And that C minor prelude and fugue that you referred to was the result of a bet that he took with Strauss years before, and he kept his side of the bargain. But he's not a Richard Strauss. He is an English composer who was thinking in the terms of the way English musicians play, thinking of all those amateur orchestras up and down the country, which he himself has spent half a lifetime with, and he knew what instrumentalists were thinking from within the ranks. The style of orchestration of Falstaff is not the sort of polychromatic, highly veneered style of Richard Strauss. It is much more soloistic, in fact, and if you try and play it as though it's a grand Technicolor scheme, you'll get it wrong. But this recording, precisely because it is slightly unsophisticated, I call it natural, a realistic English sound, gets the spirit of it. I mean, you can think of amateur dramatics doing Shakespeare in a village hall, and this is Falstaff.
It's a bit of the Eastcheap scene. part of the East Sheep scene from Elgar's Falstaff, a 1950 recording. It's Adrian Boult conducting the London Philharmonic. I think it's a brilliant point you made about the village hall and the whole spirit of the performance, and that's no doubt why it's being reissued. Also, of course, Boult gets on with it. He takes a good, straightforward line through the piece. It doesn't fall apart in his hands.
Which it so easily could do, because it is such a complex piece, in spite of what I've just said, the details of markings in each part and the complex way that Elgar's put it together, motifs here, motifs there, which somehow Boult has mastered without losing the thread of the argument.
It's a Testament release, and the number's SBT 1106. We come on to another Dutton disc now, and this is of a forgotten conductor in some ways, his assistant to Barbara Raleigh at the Halle for a time, George Weldon, and it's a record of Vaughan Williams, Holst and Bax, and the Holst, the St Paul's Suite and the Band of the Perfect Fool with the Philharmonia Orchestra in 1953, which is very much an early vintage, good vintage of Philharmonia recordings, isn't it?
The sound of the string playing here is quite remarkable. It had me sitting up. This is the record that I keep coming back to. It is pure magic. And it made me, I suppose, like I hope it will do for many people, re-evaluate what I think about George Weldon. And it goes back to my very first point, which is that somehow the English musical scene was always regarded as somehow second-rate in comparison to the international scene. Weldon was the sort of man who really, it appears, didn't have the kind of gung-ho, go-get-it quality, which in a sense is why he's such a sensitive artist. And what you get here, what we now have time to think about, poor chap, he's not with us, is that very refined quality that he had. Highly sensitive, beautifully musical. Not only with the Philharmonia playing well, but what he gets them to do is so... And, of course, the London Symphony Orchestra, because we're going to hear them playing Tintagel soon.
It's very interesting. In the St Paul's Suite, in the intermezzo, we'll hear that very civilised leader the Philharmonia had, Manouk Brekyan, at that time. There seems to be a wonderful ensemble here between the orchestra, between the leader, between the conductor.
If I had this record for anything, it would be for the playing of Manouk Brekyan.
Part of Holst's St Paul's Suite, George Weldon conducting the Philharmonia Orchestra in 1953. We're going to hear Bax's Tintagel, the LSO with Weldon, the same year, 1953, in a moment. There is another disc that's come our way, hasn't there, from Decca on their Bellart label, which also has... Well, it says a 1964 recording by Boult, but that's rubbish. He didn't record it in 1964. It's actually a 1954 recording by Boult of the same piece, of Tintagel. The sound is horrible on this Bellart disc, and it hasn't been very well transferred. I actually prefer Boult's performance to Weldon's in one respect. You know, the surging sea and the cliffs and all these references to Tristan and Isolde and everything. I just feel that a great conductor knows where the real climaxes are, and I feel that Weldon rather plays every climax as a climax, whereas Boult knows where he's going ultimately. That's why I would say the Bolt is a better performance. But
This is, well, I agree with you in many respects. This is Bolt and the LPO again, and as you say, he's a master conductor. He can put his baton down ever so slightly, and everybody knows exactly what he wants. He's got the score, the mastery of the notes on the page. What I think he hasn't got is that sense of magic and mystery, which I think is quintessentially Arnold Bax. Bax, the Celtic mystic.
Yeah.
Bax not being the English gentleman. I just want to say very, very quickly about this Bell Art disc that it fascinates me because of the product that it is. It actually has a very interesting repertoire on it. Things like Vaughan Williams' Old King Cole, a very good performance, I think, of the Holst Perfect Fool Ballet. But it is riddled with mistakes. The Old King Cole is 1856 long, not 15 minutes, as it says on the back. You pointed out a date. And in fact, the whole package of information given on the disc is very thin. It seems to have been thrown together, which is a pity, because the basic repertoire planning is very clever.
But the Dutton Laboratories disc has no such problems. And we're going to hear now this LSA recording with George Weldon of Tintagel. And so you're saying, listen for the atmosphere, listen for the Celtic twilight, the mystery.
I'm listening for that. I'm listening for the quality of ecstasy, which I think is, again, quintessentially Baxian, which I think a poet like Weldon could do, because he was so restrained. Bolt's, yes, it has lots of colour, lots of energy, and it grew on me, but Weldon's is poetic, more restrained, slightly withdrawn, a bit like Bax himself.
the symphonic poem Tintagel by Bax, a 1953 recording with George Weldon conducting the London Symphony Orchestra. And that's now on Dutton Laboratories, a programme of English music that also includes Vaughan Williams' incidental music for Aristophanes' comedy The Wasps, Gustav Holst's St. Paul's Suite and his ballet The Perfect Fool. The numbers CD CLP 4002. I was talking earlier to Chris D'Souza, and he'll be back here on Radio 3 at 1 o'clock this afternoon with the fifth of 6 programmes in the Vintage Years series on Vladimir Ashkenazy, who's 60 tomorrow. Many happy returns. Record Review is produced by Clive Portbury and Susan Kenyon and presented by me, Richard Osborne.